6 days before my bakery turned 30 years old, the woman who had cleaned our floors every morning since before my daughter was born grabbed my wrist in the parking lot and said, "Don't go in yet. Something's wrong in there." Her name was Hattie. She was 71 years old, and she had never once in 30 years asked me to do anything. I looked past her at the building. The lights were on in the back office, the one my late husband had used, the one I had not changed since he passed. His coffee mug was still on the shelf. I had asked that no one use that room without me. Hattie said, "Follow me around the side. There's a window." I don't know why I didn't argue. Maybe because Hattie was not a woman who alarmed easily. Maybe because something in my chest already knew. I followed her along the side of the building, past the dumpsters and the delivery pallets, to the narrow window that looked into the back hallway just outside the office. The blinds were angled open just enough. My son-in-law was inside. He was standing at my husband's desk with a man I didn't recognize, a younger man in a gray jacket who had papers spread across the surface. My son-in-law was pointing at something on the pages and nodding. He had his phone pressed between his ear and his shoulder, and he was speaking low and fast in a way that reminded me of someone who does not want to be overheard. I watched him for perhaps 45 seconds. That was long enough. I thanked Hattie quietly and walked back to my car. I sat there with the engine off and the windows up. It was the second week of October, the kind of morning where the light is thin and everything looks a little faded, like a photograph that has been left in the sun. 30 years, that was what was inside that building. 30 years of my life and my husband's life, and every decision we had ever made together about how to build something that would last. I did not go inside. I drove to the coffee shop 2 blocks down, and I ordered a large coffee I didn't drink, and I sat in the corner, and I thought, let me tell you something about Sunrise Provisions before I tell you what happened next. My husband Boyd and I opened it in 1994 in a strip mall in Dayton, Ohio, with a small business loan, a second-hand oven, and one employee, his cousin, who quit after 4 months. We specialized in custom celebration cakes, corporate catering, and what Boyd called the kind of food that makes people feel like someone was thinking about them. By our 10th year, we had moved to our own building on Granger Avenue. By our 20th, we had a full commercial kitchen, a staff of 18, and a contract with the Dayton Convention Center that renewed automatically every 2 years because they had never found a reason not to renew it. Boyd died of a heart attack at 63. It was a Thursday morning in November, and he had been in the middle of tasting a new cranberry glaze when it happened. He was the kind of man who died doing exactly what he cared about. I have never fully decided if that is a comfort or an additional grief. After he was gone, my daughter and her husband came back from Columbus. My daughter had been working in hospital administration and was good at it. She did not want to leave her job, but she came back for me, and I was grateful. Her husband was a business consultant. He had an MBA from Ohio State, and the kind of easy confidence that makes people assume he knows more than he said out loud. He took a look at our operations and said there were efficiencies we were missing. I let him help because my daughter loved him and because I was too tired in those first 2 years to push back on someone who seemed capable. His name is Sumner. He has always been polite to me. He calls me by my first name, which is Vivienne. He remembers my birthday and he shakes hands firmly, and he is the kind of man who makes every room feel like he belongs there. What I did not see until that October morning was that belonging is not the same as ownership, and that Sumner had, in the 2 years since Boyd died, begun treating my company like something that was already his. At the coffee shop, I called my attorney. Her name is Catherine, and she has been my business attorney for 19 years. She answered on the second ring, which is what she always does, and when I finished telling her what I had seen, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't go back in today. Don't tell Sumner you were there. Come to my office this afternoon and bring your last 2 years of financials if you can access them remotely. We have 6 days before your anniversary event." I asked her what she thought was happening. She said, "I think you should let me find out first." I drove home. I walked through the house that Boyd and I had lived in for 28 years, past the photograph in the hallway of the two of us standing in front of the strip mall building with the sign that read Sunrise Provisions, Grand Opening. Both of us young and slightly terrified and trying not to show it. I thought about what my son-in-law had been doing at my husband's desk. I thought about the man in the grey jacket and the papers spread out like a map of something I hadn't been invited to see. I did not call my daughter that day. That was the hardest part. She was at her job in Columbus, 30 minutes away, and I wanted to call her more than I wanted anything. But I did not know yet what I was calling to say, and I was not certain which direction her loyalty would pull when I said it. That afternoon, Catherine brought in a forensic accountant named Roland. He was a quiet man in his 60s, very still in the way of someone who has spent decades looking for what people hoped he wouldn't find. He asked me questions about our revenue structure, our supply contracts, our recent financial filings. He asked about the convention center contract. He asked when we had last had an independent audit. I told him 2 years ago, right after Boyd died. He wrote that down. The next morning, Roland called at 7:40. He said, "I need you to come in. I've found 3 things. The first one is straightforward. The second one is not. The third one is going to be hard to hear." I drove to Catherine's office. Roland had a yellow legal pad and a manila envelope. He opened it and began. The first thing, a limited liability company called Granger Provisions, LLC, had been registered in Ohio 8 weeks prior. Listed as managing member, a holding company called Lakeview Advisory Group. Lakeview Advisory Group shared its registered agent with a private equity firm called Northway Capital Partners. Northway Capital Partners had completed 4 acquisitions of small regional food service businesses in the past 3 years. In each case, the previous owner had sold at between 30 and 45% below independent appraised value. In each case, there had been an internal figure who had provided Northway with adjusted financial documentation showing declining performance. Sunrise Provisions was the 5th business matching that profile. Roland laid the second document on the table. It was an email, Sumner to a man named Prescott at Northway Capital, dated September 19th. The subject line read, Sunrise, Final Valuation Narrative and Timeline. In the email, Sumner had outlined what he called a performance stabilization concern. He described me as approaching a natural transition point, noted that operational leadership had become increasingly reliant on legacy relationships rather than scalable systems, and suggested that the upcoming 30th anniversary was a natural emotional moment at which a transition agreement would feel appropriate and celebratory rather than clinical. He had attached a financial summary showing our annual revenue at $1.4 million. Our actual annual revenue was $2.3 million. He had removed our convention center contract from the recurring revenue column and reclassified it as a non-renewal risk, despite the fact that I had received the renewal confirmation in writing 8 weeks earlier. Roland placed the third document on the table. He did not say anything for a moment. It was a case filing from the state of Indiana, 2021. A woman named, I will not use her name here because she asked me not to, had owned a small regional catering company for 22 years. Her son-in-law had joined the business following the death of her husband. Within 18 months, he had connected her with a buyer, restructured the financial presentation of the company to show declining margins, and facilitated a sale at roughly 40% below actual market value. He had received a private advisory fee of $180,000 from the acquiring firm. The case had settled. The son-in-law had signed an agreement. He had used a different entity name in Ohio. Roland looked at me across the table. He said, Sumner has done this before. Catherine spoke before I could. She said, "The anniversary event is Saturday. Sumner has been telling your daughter this is a restructuring agreement, a gift to secure the next generation of the business. He plans to present you with the transition documents at the dinner following the 30-year celebration. We can file an emergency motion to freeze any asset transfer. But to do it cleanly, we need him to present the documents on record. We need witnesses." I asked about my daughter. Catherine said, "She's not on the Granger provisions filing, but I need to know where she stands before Saturday." I drove home and I stood in my kitchen for a long time. My daughter is 41 years old. She is careful and organized, and she carries things quietly, the way I do, the way her father did. She has her father's handwriting and his habit of folding his hands when he's listening to make sure the other person knows he's paying attention. She had been good to me since Boyd died. She had come back to Dayton when she did not have to. She had handled the insurance paperwork and the estate filings and the staff meeting I couldn't bring myself to lead the first week Boyd was gone. I did not believe she knew what Sumner was doing, but I needed to be certain. That night, I asked her to come to the house. I told her I needed help with some anniversary logistics. She came at 7. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I had done the bakery books every Sunday morning for 20 years, while Boyd made breakfast. I did not tell her what I knew. What I said was this: "I've been looking at the business documents Sumner put together for Saturday. Some of the revenue numbers don't match what I have. Do you know what figures he's been working from?" She set down her mug. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He told me the accountant found some irregularities in how the convention center contract had been classified. He said the real numbers were lower than we'd been reporting." I said, "Did he show you the actual documents?" She said no. I said, "Did you ask to see them?" She was quiet again, this time for longer. Then she said slowly, "I assumed he would tell me if there was something I needed to know." There it was, not complicity, trust, the particular trust of a woman who loved her husband and had been told a story that made his version of events feel like caretaking. I poured more tea and I changed the subject. The next morning, before Sumner arrived at the bakery, I called our head baker, a woman named Lois who had been with us since the 3rd year of the business. Lois was 64, stout, and had a memory like an archive. She had trained every baker who had ever worked our ovens, had shown up the week after Boyd died, and quietly rearranged the schedule so no one had to ask me what to do. She was the kind of person who understood things before they were explained to her. I told her I needed her to pay attention to Sumner's movements in the building over the next 2 days and to let me know if anything seemed unusual. She did not ask why. She said, "I've been watching that man for 14 months." And she ended the call. On Friday morning, Lois texted me. She had come in at 4:30 for the morning prep, which she always did. Sumner had arrived at 6, which was unusual. He had been in the back office for 40 minutes before the rest of the staff arrived. He had used the document shredder, which was kept in the supply room and was not something he had any operational reason to use. He had taken a photograph of something on my desk with his personal phone. I sat with that for a moment. Then I called Catherine. She said the emergency filing was ready. She said she had also reached the woman from Indiana, the one whose case had settled in 2021. She said the woman wanted to speak. She said she was willing to be present on Saturday, either in person or by video, if I thought it would help. I said I thought it would help. The anniversary event was held in the event space attached to our Granger Avenue facility. We had rented the adjoining hall, put up white cafe lights and long linen-covered tables, and ordered the kind of spread that made clear this was not a modest occasion. 112 people had been invited, staff going back 15 years, long-time clients, the couple who had owned the space next to our original strip mall location and had come to our opening day, Judge Harlan, who had been Boyd's college friend and had attended our 10th and 20th anniversary events and had never missed one. I had written a toast, not the one I'd originally prepared, a different one. Sumner arrived at 5:30, looking relaxed and confident. He hugged me and told me the room looked beautiful. My daughter was beside him in the blue dress she'd worn to Boyd's last birthday dinner. She squeezed my hand and said she was proud of me. I held her hand an extra moment. Roland was near the back of the room with two people from the county sheriff's office, both in plain clothes. Catherine was at a table near the windows with a folder in her lap. The woman from Indiana was connected by laptop, set up discreetly near the AV station. At 7:30, my daughter took the microphone first. She thanked the staff and the clients, and she talked about her father. She teared up once, caught herself, kept going. She looked like him when she pushed through something hard. I had to look at the table for a moment. Then she introduced me. I walked to the front of the room, and I looked out at 112 people, and I began the way I had planned. I talked about 1994. I talked about the strip mall and the second-hand oven and Boyd's cousin who quit. I talked about the fire we had in 2003 that destroyed our refrigeration units and the way our clients had prepaid orders we hadn't filled yet, just so we would have the cash to rebuild, because they trusted us and didn't want us to close. I talked about Boyd measuring every surface in the new kitchen himself with a tape measure, because he said if you build it wrong at the beginning, it costs you twice as much to fix it later. The room is quiet in the way that means people are actually listening. Then I stopped. I said, 30 years teaches you certain things. One of them is the difference between someone who builds alongside you and someone who is waiting for you to look the other way. The room shifted. A few people glanced at each other. Sumner, at table 4, was very still. I nodded at the AV technician. The screen behind me lit up. The Granger Provisions LLC filing appeared. Managing member, Lakeview Advisory Group, the Northway Capital Connection, the registration date, 8 weeks ago. I said, someone has been telling a story about this business. The story is that it's declining, that I'm past my best years, that the right move is a quiet transition before it's too late. I want you to see what that story looked like on paper, and then I want you to see what is actually true. The next slide, Sumner's email to Prescott at Northway, the revenue figure he had submitted, $1.4 million. Our actual revenue, $2.3 million. The convention center contract, reclassified as a non-renewal risk. I said, that contract was renewed in August, for 3 years. I have the signed confirmation here. From table 9, Gordon Alice stood up. He had been the convention center's events director for 11 years and had renewed that contract personally. He said, I signed that renewal in August. I signed it myself. He sat back down without another word, and I could see from his expression that he understood exactly what it meant, that he was clarifying it. Sumner pushed back his chair. He said my name. His voice was even, but his hands were flat on the table the way hands go when someone is deciding something. I said, please sit down. He didn't. Catherine stood. Judge Harlan, who had been sitting at table 2 with the careful stillness of a man who already knew what was coming, rose from his seat. He announced that an emergency order had been issued that afternoon, freezing all asset transfers associated with Granger Provisions LLC and any agreements involving Northway Capital Partners as they pertain to Sunrise Provisions. Sumner looked to the exit. Roland's colleagues moved from 2 directions. I turned back to the room. I said, this is not the first time. I walked them through the Indiana case. I described the structure, the same holding company pattern, the same adjusted financial narrative, the same private advisory fee upon closing. A woman who had built something for 22 years and signed it away at a celebration dinner because someone she trusted told her it was the right thing for her family. I said, she is here tonight. The laptop screen near the AV station came on. The woman appeared, grey-haired and steady, sitting at what looked like a kitchen table. She said her name. She said how many years she had run her business and how much she had sold it for and what it had actually been worth. She looked into the camera. She said I spent 2 years trying to understand how I let it happen. I understand it now. I just wish someone had shown me what I'm seeing on that screen before I picked up the pen. Sumner was being walked toward the side entrance. He was speaking in a controlled, low voice. I could not hear what he was saying. I did not need to. My daughter had not moved from her seat. She was looking at the table. Her hands were in her lap, and her face had the color of someone who has had something very large rearranged without warning. I stepped down from the front, and I crossed the room. I sat beside her. She did not look up immediately. When she did, her eyes were full, but she was not crying. She said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know." She said, "The numbers he showed me, he said the accountant had found." I said, "I know what he told you." She said, "Mom, just that." I put my hand over hers and I said, "You believed your husband. That is not a thing I will hold against you. What I want you to understand is what is true and what has always been true about what we built here." She looked at me and I could see her sorting through the last several months, reassembling them with different information. I knew that feeling. I had done it twice in the past 6 days. The first time I had felt only fury. The second time something quieter, something closer to grief about my own part in it. Because I had a part in it. I had kept my daughter at arm's length from the real operations of the bakery for 2 years. When Boyd died, I had closed ranks around the business instead of opening them. I had told myself I was protecting her by managing the hard parts alone. What I had actually done was leave space beside me that someone else was willing to fill. Sumner had found that space and walked into it. I had made the opening without knowing it. I sat with my daughter until the room had mostly cleared. Roland's colleagues returned to confirm the filing was complete. Catherine gave me a small nod from across the room. Hattie, who had come as my guest, was standing near the kitchen entrance with her coat already on, watching me with the expression of someone who had done their job and was satisfied. Later, Catherine walked me through what came next. Sumner was charged with breach of fiduciary duty and fraud. The Indiana case was reopened in conjunction with the Ohio filing when the woman there agreed to re-engage. Northway Capital, when investigators made clear they understood the full structure of the advisory fee arrangements, cooperated. Their acquisition pipeline had been built in part on this kind of facilitated undervaluation, and they were willing to provide documentation rather than face wider exposure. Sumner's arrangement with Lakeview Advisory Group would have paid him a $210,000 private fee upon closing. The sale price he had negotiated for Sunrise Provisions was $1.1 million. The independent appraisal commissioned after the filing assessed actual value at $2.6 million. The difference was $1.5 million. By February, our books had been independently audited and confirmed. Our revenue projection for the following year was $2.5 million. We hired a business manager, a man named Clifford, who had spent 16 years in food service operations and asked careful questions and wrote everything down. He was the kind of person who understood that being trusted with someone else's work is a different responsibility than being trusted with your own. My daughter took a leave from her job in Columbus and spent 3 months working at the bakery. Not because I asked her to, but because she wanted to understand what she had almost lost without knowing it was in danger. She worked the front counter some mornings. She sat in on the staff meetings. She learned how Lois organized the production calendar and why the convention center contract was structured the way it was. She asked questions I had never thought to ask her if she had. I watched her in the kitchen one afternoon in January, her sleeves rolled up, learning from Lois how to score the top of a bread loaf correctly, and I thought, this is what I was protecting her from. The weight of it, the daily details, the understanding that a business is not a building or a name on a sign, but a set of relationships you have to keep choosing to maintain. I had tried to spare her that weight. In sparing her, I had kept her from knowing what she stood on. Hattie retired in March. At the small party we threw for her in the back of the bakery, she told me she hadn't done anything special the morning she stopped me in the parking lot. She said she'd just seen a man in a room he wasn't supposed to be in, doing something he didn't want anyone to see, and she'd thought someone should know. I told her that was exactly the right thought to have. I have thought about that parking lot a great deal since then, about the doors we walk through because they're there and we have always walked through them, about the people who stand outside those doors and see what we cannot see from the inside, about whether we have created the kind of place where someone like Hattie feels safe enough to stop us. I think about Boyd, too, not with grief now, mostly, with something more like gratitude that he built the foundation level, that he understood from the beginning that everything you make has to be made correctly all the way down, because you don't get to go back and fix the base once the rest of it is standing. I kept his coffee mug on the shelf in the back office. I kept the bakery. And I kept my daughter more honestly than I had before, which turned out to be the part that mattered most. If you've listened this far, thank you. This story cost me something to carry and more to say out loud, and I am grateful you were here for it. Tell me in the comments, if you had been standing in that parking lot with Hattie, if you had seen what she saw through that window, would you have told me? Or would you have told yourself it wasn't your business? I think about that question more than you'd expect, because the answer says something about what kind of place Sunrise Provisions had become, and what kind of place I hope it stays. I still think about that parking lot, the thin October light, Hattie's hand on my wrist and the particular stillness in her face that told me she had already weighed whether to say something and had decided it mattered more than the awkwardness of saying it. What I know now, that I did not know then, is that what happened to Sunrise Provisions was not on his doing. I mean that plainly. He made his choices, and those choices had consequences. The filing, the charges, the civil case that followed. Actions move in one direction, and then they arrive somewhere. And he arrived at exactly the place his choices were always pointing toward. That is not a mystery. That is just how things work when you follow a line far enough. But I had drawn part of that line myself. I closed my daughter out of the business because I thought I was protecting her from the weight of it. I told myself she had her own career, her own life, that the daily responsibilities of Sunrise were mine to carry alone. What I was actually doing was making myself the only person who understood what the business was really worth, and that kind of isolation does not protect anything. It creates a vacancy, and Sumner, who was sharp in ways I had underestimated, found that vacancy and furnished it. I have thought about what it takes to see something like this coming. Not in the dramatic sense, not the moment Hattie stopped me in the parking lot, but earlier, months earlier. The kind of seeing that requires you to be honest about what you've built and who you've let stand close to it and why. That kind of seeing takes more than intelligence. It takes the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions about yourself before someone else forces them on you. I was not doing that. I was running a business on muscle memory and trust, and the assumption that loyalty I had earned over 30 years was the same thing as safety. It is not the same thing. Lois had been watching Sumner for 14 months before I asked her to. She had not said anything because I had not asked. I think about that. I had a woman in my kitchen who saw clearly and said nothing because the environment I had built made her uncertain whether her seeing would be welcome. That is on me. A business where the people closest to the work feel they cannot speak is a business that has quietly decided to be blind. What I carry from all of this is not a lesson about fraud or legal filings or how to protect an asset on paper. It is something simpler and harder. That integrity is not just about what you do when you're being watched. It's about what you build when no one's watching. The kind of place where Hattie feels safe enough to grab your wrist, where Lois knows her 14 months of careful observation matters, where your daughter feels like she belongs to the thing she stands to inherit. I had the first kind of integrity. I was still working on the second kind. I'm still working on it now. That feels right. 30 years is long enough to know that the work doesn't stop because you've survived something. Boyd used to say the level doesn't lie. You can want the surface to be even all you like, but if you don't check it honestly, you'll build everything wrong on top of it. He meant it about the kitchen counters he measured himself in 1994. He meant it about more than that. I know that now better than I did when he was alive to say it.